Awesome, sweet. We are live. So if you could just start out with a brief little intro, just explaining who you are and what you do, that would be great.
Cool. My name's Tony McWilliam. I'm an Australian who lives in Verbier, Switzerland, of all places. And I've just started another company called Ghosts, which is striving to make environmentally friendly technical outerwear. My background is in product design. I came to Europe it's a long time ago now, nearly 20 years ago, actually.
Wow.
And in 2003, 2004, I started a ski company called Faction, and me and a business partner that I met, and a great team of kind of 30 to 40 staff now who kind of built that up over the last 15 years. And then I left that about a year and a half ago, just because I was at this stage where the company was doing okay, and it was kind of that opportunity where I had my second daughter, and running a company is stressful. So I needed a little bit of a break, and it was also an opportunity to say, look, if I could spend the next kind of 15, 20 years doing something, what would I like to do, and how could I make a difference, and how could I make sure it was something that would hopefully leave something for my daughters. So sorry, that was a bit of a drawn out introduction, but yeah, that's a little bit of a background.
No, that was great. And I think it's cool because as I talk to more people, it just seems like a lot of these issues are so intertwined and interconnected with so many other things, whether that's family or technology or the outdoors. It's like you can't really pull on one without pulling on something else.
No, exactly. And I think, the topic that that you kind of touched on is the fact that we're finding a lot more people in the creative industries and fashion and sporting industries who are really getting conscious about the environment. And they're actually starting to see, although, 5 years ago, they probably couldn't have done anything about it, there are things you can do now which are making a difference. And especially being in the mountains, I live in the mountains. I'd love to be able to show you out the window actually right now, but it's a bit dark. But being in the mountains, you're consciously aware of the weather. So you're consciously aware of what and being in a ski resort, you're consciously aware of what the snowpack has done over the last month, 2 months, because you're consciously looking at whether things are stable, where things are safe to go, etc. So it means over a decade, or well, double that, living in the Alps, I kind of have this memory of how the weather patterns have changed, and that's definitely over the last 5 years we've seen the weather in Europe shift, time-wise, and also it's got more intense, and the temperature change, the differential in temperature over time has got more intense as well. So you'll have a few days where it'll be freezing cold and the snow will be great, and then it'll get really warm really quickly. Mm-hmm. And that didn't happen so much. I'm probably second guessing actual scientific research here, but all I can talk about is anecdotally, and that's one of the things that's really made me like trigger in my head, shit, we need to do something about this. And one of the things I think also is interesting is I also appreciate, for someone living in a city, they're probably just not aware of how much impact change in the weather really does have on not just the environment, but also a community. For example, if Easter is late and there's lots of snow and we get a lot of people coming out over Easter, then the town is alive. People can stay on longer. There's the ski instructors still keep their jobs for another month. The chalets are still full. The bars are still full. There's people here, and the town is still buzzing. That if it's a bad winter and it's short, then people just stop, and a lot of people lose their livelihoods. They lose another month of income. They have to look for another job. So it's something that kind of living in this environment is really focused on how the weather really does affect our livelihood and our community and everything. So one of the interesting things in the position where we are about starting an environmentally friendly or trying to be environmentally sustainable business is that you're always going to have this challenge that a lot of your target market is going to be in a city or an urban environment, and they're not going to be as aware of the impact of what we're trying to achieve. So you can sit there and you can kind of bang on the door and talk about environment, but at the end of the day, if the product isn't fantastic and the product doesn't work and it doesn't look great, then it's not going to be something that they're going to consider buying. I think 5 years ago, you could say that you could charge a little bit extra for being, environmentally friendly, but now I feel that personally, I feel you shouldn't have to. Personally, I feel that should just be part of a product. And I don't think you can compete purely on that story anymore.
Yeah, totally. And there's kind of so much to unpack with that, everything that you just said. But I think to start, it was interesting for me living in a ski town for a couple of years. It wasn't even very long, but I've kind of bumped around a lot. So what's been interesting is when I get into a new city or a new environment, starting to pay attention to some of those weather shifts and realizing that I don't have the background of that area to really know what things were like, but also as of recently moving around more, kind of coming to terms with the fact that there isn't really a norm anymore. Like as you come into a new city and you kind of get a feel for it, you're getting a feel for the same thing that locals may be feeling also, because it's, these huge swings are happening in ways where you can't, like when you're talking to someone about weather, they're like, well, you used to get rain at this time during the season and now it's just not like that anymore. So that's kind of strange.
Well, and the other aspect of it is we don't want to believe it's happening. We really don't. I don't want to believe that climate change is happening. I would just want to believe that the winters are just going to keep going and it's all going to be fine. And I know that there was a season in either 60s or the 70s in France where they got absolutely no snow. So if you do just look at it from a kind of a scientific historical point of view, you can kind of say, well, we don't really know. It's shifting, it's changing. Who knows if it's climate change or not? But I think we've passed the point of just saying, well, it'll be fine. I think we're at a point now, or everything seems to be at a point now where we're like, no, we have to do something. Whether we can actually make a difference or not, we have to try, because there isn't any other option. We can't just let it just kind of disappear. Not disappear, but I mean, we can't just let whatever happens. I mean, if you just look at things like plastic consumption or oil consumption or whatever, it's just stupid. It's like being in a lifeboat made out of wood and burning it to keep warm. Like, at some point there's no wood left, and it's the same thing. And it just doesn't make any sense to be mining oil out of the ground where we could be using plastics which are already out there and have been for 50 years, and we can recycle those plastics. We can get them out of landfill, we can take them out of clothing, and we can actually do something and build something out of it, rather than going and mining new virgin material. It just makes common sense in my head, but I might be unusual.
No, I agree. And I think even if you take kind of the climate aspect out of it, because there's so many people that want to try and poke holes in that way of thinking. Even if you're looking at just what we're doing to ourselves as people, it's ridiculous. And it all kind of stems from this business world, which is why I'm always interested to talk to people that are at that intersection, such as yourself, because you're seeing like, how do I get this done and what's working and what's not, both in regards to the product itself, but also running the business and how all of that's changing. Because I think another big aspect of what you're trying to do is, how do you market this to people in a way where they're aware of what you're doing, but also it seems like the whole industry is kind of like, this is the first step in that the sustainability is coming more to the forefront. But as that kind of picks up, it seems like that's just going to be one pillar of what an overall business is and how that starts to change.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. As we touched on earlier, for me, sustainability should just be a given. It doesn't matter what it is, and you are seeing it across all different industries. You're seeing the automotive industry, for example, being completely disrupted, but not just by alternative methods of propulsion, i.e. electric versus diesel or gasoline or whatever, but looking at car sharing and looking at actual the way you purchase that product being more along the lines of, okay, we just use it for a certain period of time and then it goes back and it gets either recycled or repurposed or reused or whatever. And you're seeing things like rent the runway. So for example, in the fashion industry, you're seeing it happen in the fashion industry as well. I mean, I'm a bit, as a designer and as a product designer, I'm kind of always, I love things. So I kind of always want those things to be mine. So I'm not sure how many of those items I'd actually feel comfortable with kind of giving back. But, you look at shoes, okay? I've got 5 pairs of shoes out the front of that door, and I'm like, actually, half of them are probably at the point where I should throw them out. But then where do I throw them out? You can donate them to, we have pretty good donation facilities here in Switzerland for clothing, but it's a shoe which is pretty much worn out. What am I going to do with that? But at the same time, I know that, you could actually break that thing down and you could take it apart into its raw materials and you could do something else with those raw materials. But there isn't the facility to do that yet. And I know Nike just launched their what's it called? Future Light? No, not Future Light. That's North Face. Yesterday they launched.
I think that was Adidas, wasn't it?
Oh, is it Adidas? I read it and I can't remember already.
Those camps would kill you over that comment.
They probably would. But yes, that shoe and part of that. I mean, it's fantastic that bigger brands are taking those steps, but I feel they could go a lot further. But that was one of the first stories I read where they're actually talking about, we need to think more than just the product. We need to think how the product is consumed, how the product is then reused and broken down afterwards. And, should we collect it and take it back again and do something else with it? And that's going to be really hard for sneakerheads because, everything's collectible and everything's worth a ton of money. But it's the same thing that what we want to do with Ghosts is we actually want to be part of the entire life cycle of the product. We don't want to just have the person kind of take the jacket, pant, whatever, and disappear. We want to be part of the journey. We want to be able to repair something if it goes wrong. We want to be able to say, if you've had it for 5 years or 10 years and it's had a good life, maybe you want to donate that, and we have people we can give that to. There's a great group here in just across the border in France, actually, called Riders for Refugees, who donate a lot of stuff, or we donated a lot of stuff with them for at Faction as well, which goes to refugee camps in France and also over in Greece and around the Med, for example. But having that facility to be able to offer to a customer and go, hey, you can donate this to someone and we will give you a discount on a new product, or we can repair it for you, or actually we can break that down and we can turn it into an entirely new jacket. So just actually being able to think of that process is an entirely new step, which 5 years ago people weren't really thinking about. So a lot's changed. And actually one of the reasons I really started looking into the apparel side of things is that on the hard goods side, so skis, snowboards, etc., it was a lot of the brands trying to change things and the factories and the supply chain not having the infrastructure or the technology to be able to change. But on the apparel side, it's the other. On the apparel side, it's the factories are the ones that are going, hey, we can do this and we can recycle this and we can change this material into that and we can build you a sustainable supply chain, but it's the brands who aren't changing. So it was a really interesting process for me to actually jump into this world and kind of say, oh, hang on, if I have this idea, I can do that. And you guys can do that. And to be able to look at the supply chain and actually build a brand around that supply chain rather than the other way, which is making skis and always be fighting with a factory to try and do something sustainable. So that was a really great discovery. And that's why I really kind of inspired me in the end to go, no, stuff, I'm going to do this myself because it's possible and it's important and it should be happening. And if I can show that I can do it, then hopefully I can inspire others, maybe the medium-sized brands rather than the bigger brands, but actually they can start instigating these processes. So even though, traditional business practice is, well, if you have a secret way of doing things, you should keep it. My philosophy is the other way. Like, well, part of sustainability is being transparent, and part of actually instigating change is sharing what you've found. So, I already work with quite a few other smaller apparel brands who are just friends through the snow sports industry. So be able to just jump on a call and go, hey, I found this factory and they make this, or I, found this warehouse and it will provide things in a different way than you've been doing before. I found this fabric mill and they've got this technology. It's just a great community, a larger community rather than just a town, a community of people who are all kind of focused on the same thing and focused on heading in the same direction. So that's been a great process as well. And sorry, I went on a complete tangent there, Nick.
Oh no, I love it. I love when that happens because it helps me kind of sift through like where to go next. Because I think what gets difficult is when someone hits one thing and then tosses it back over to me, and I'm like, crap. Now I got to think through that real quick and keep the conversation going. But yeah, I think it's interesting because as I saw this sustainability thing kind of start to come to the forefront, it seemed like the first thing that started happening. And it seems like this is all happening very, very quickly. The first thing that started happening was like it started bleeding into more marketing stuff. And then it was like, as a consumer, you're looking at it like, okay, what is the actual basis of a lot of these claims? And you're kind of going into it like a lot of this just kind of, there's no real depth to it. So then the next step is, how much of these stats are real, what's actually going on here, and where is all the difficulties. And then you kind of get to a point where you're like, I got to do this myself. And then you start to see other people that are doing it themselves, and you kind of hit these like layers of
We
these
had
aha moments.
No, I love that you brought up that topic, because we had internally at Faction, when, so the kind of a year before I left, we were looking at how we kind of develop sustainability as part of our business. And we brought on a sustainability expert who worked with Gap and the US government and things like that. And when we started going through things with her, as soon as you sit down and you can say, look, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this, even in our own team of people who, are our friends, guys I've worked together for a decade kind of thing. When you start talking about sustainability, for some reason, people just start feeling like they've got to critique it. And I don't know why. And I think you're right, because I think there has been a lot of greenwashing over the last couple of years, and people throw around the word sustainable, and that shouldn't be. We should be talking about trying to be more environmentally friendly or have a reduced environmental impact. But as soon as you start saying sustainable, you've got to start questioning it, because to actually say this is sustainable is such a big claim that there are so many elements that people have to think of to claim that. But it was really interesting, because I do feel, maybe less so now, but a couple of years ago, as soon as you started talking about, we want to make an environmentally friendly apparel brand, people start trying to dig holes in you. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's because it's a kind of a backlash against a lot of marketing that's been going out there. And there is a lot of people who kind of tend to claim that things are environmentally friendly, or they claim they're being transparent about the supply chain, and you look into it and actually it's really kind of the bare minimum of what they could do to kind of make themselves look green. So I think there is a big challenge on how we as an industry talk about sustainability and talk about environmental impact, to be able to reach a kind of a set of criteria to say, yes, we are that, we are that, we are that. And there's not really a lot of accreditation practices which cover sustainability as a whole. You can use, so there's things like Blue Sign or Ocutex or BSC, which are all different accreditations of different elements of a supply chain. But to actually say your entire supply chain is sustainable or environmentally friendly, there's actually nothing at the moment that you can use to actually check it, to check that claim and to benchmark it against other industries and other businesses in your industry. There's something called the Higgs Index, which is developed by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition out of San Francisco. And that's a really great tool, and that's starting to get adopted by a lot more brands and a lot more businesses. And I wish that a lot more could do that, but it's rather expensive to join, unfortunately. So I think it'll take a few more years before we kind of achieve true transparency to be able to then start working towards sustainability as a whole. There's one example for there's a brand, it's a Scandinavian brand who are talking about being sustainable and transparent, and on their factory they list their factory. But in an apparel supply chain, the factory itself is only a tiny element. It's literally the last element in a whole series of things which have to come together, which all have massive environmental impact. So just listing your factory doesn't really get you anywhere. It doesn't, I'm trying to think. It's like saying I shop at. I'm trying to think of an American supermarket. I don't know American supermarket. It's like saying I should shop at Whole Foods rather than shopping at I don't know any supermarkets. But whereas what you actually need to know is like, well, okay, where did that apple come from? How was it transported from where the apple is grown to where it kind of sat in a warehouse for a while, to where it actually got to Whole Foods itself? Like, there needs to be transparency across that whole where the virgin material came from, how was it processed, what material was it then combined with to make a fabric, where do your trims come from, where does your label come from, where does your packaging come from, etc. You really need to see all these things before you can then assess whether something is less environmentally friendly or more environmentally friendly. And unfortunately, we are in a time where there's a lot of contradictory information. And there's
Yeah,
a
I
lot of,
think that portion right there is kind of where I was gonna bring up, is the fact that I think a lot of this comes from the fact that there's like kind of this whole misinformation thing going on online now, where we kind of started to see all these uh, news outlets and kind of all these facts and stuff, like at least here in the U.S. Affect the election, and then all this other stuff kind of stemming from that, and privacy and all these things, and so everyone's kind of questioning, like, what am I actually seeing here? And I think that maybe where some of that pushback may come from the sustainability side of things. But I think from my perspective too, the other side of that was even just a couple of years ago, there wasn't any real cool brands trying to incorporate that. So I think that was the other piece, was trying to step away from what people normally saw as like quote unquote crunchy kind of, product or business as a whole.
Yeah, that's true. And that just reminded me about something else, is that, unlike something like farming, where the supply chain is all kind of, it's either a couple of states away or it's a car drive away. For most of the apparel industry, it's in Asia, and it is a completely different culture, and it is a completely different environment to go to then kind of say, okay, well, how do I then trace back each stage in my supply chain? It's really difficult to actually go and visit it a lot of the time. I mean, you can. Well, actually, and that's another thing. And I know I made a comment on LinkedIn the other day on someone else's comment, and I saw you like that. It was my point that there's a lot of people talking about how they achieve sustainability, but what I'm not seeing is a lot of people just going, well, I'm just going to get on a plane and I'm going to find out where my thing that I've designed is made from and how it's made. And I think if more people did that, I don't want to condone everyone flying around the world, obviously, because that's not great. But if you start doing that, then you just start learning and you start seeing it and you start understanding it. But in big businesses, there's also a massive disconnect between kind of middle managers, designers, product managers, and then their managers as well. So a lot of the time for a designer, even to get the opportunity to go out to a factory in Asia or a fabric mill, it just doesn't happen. So a lot of the time you're kind of designing in the dark, and you go to things like performance days, or you go to ISPO, you go to the sourcing fairs, and you don't really know not what to trust, but there's just so much information there that you need help. You need someone who has experience to actually help kind of guide that process and learn about it. And I've just been lucky that I've managed to make good contacts and learn from some guys who have 30, 40, 50 years experience in the industry. And I can call them up and go, is this bullshit? Or is this right? Or is this wrong? Because, for example, there's companies who kind of take technologies from Asia and then remarket them as their own. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, you don't know if you're buying off the actual factory who's making that product, or if they're just reselling something from someone else. And it happens everywhere. I know it happens in other industries as well. But because of that whole kind of link with Asia and the cultural differences, the language differences, etc., it can be really difficult to actually find out the true provenance of what you're creating, where it came from. You have examples. So, for example, we in the apparel industry, you specify, and you specify an exact trim part. For example, I'll specify an exact zip pull from a specific company in a specific place, and I'll specify that. And the prototype will come back and it won't be that part. And you go, well, why isn't it that part? And they go, oh, well, I just got my friend to make it and it's pretty much the same, so don't worry about it. You're like, well, I kind of did that because I want to know exactly where things come from. I want to know how they're made. And I know that I can call up that person at that secondary supplier if you use that secondary supplier that I asked you to. And I know the provenance of that part. But that's just part of dealing with that supply chain, and so you kind of have to get used to it and you kind of have to expect it, and then you have to know that you have to ask every question twice and things like that. And that's part of that learning process.
Totally. And this is why I've kind of started branching out to more people such as yourself that are more industry veterans, because it seems like that knowledge hasn't yet really come through in the way that I get it directly from the source. Like it seems like the next kind of shift is like, how do we actually impart that knowledge on more people that are trying to come into this space and do things differently? Just because there is so much gray area in how all of that stuff is done in the entire process. And it just seems like it seems like the industry as a whole is kind of, we're in this weird middle ground where like the next step really doesn't exist yet, but we're still trying to understand how to deal with what we have. And so you see these different mixes of how companies are trying to handle that. And it's interesting to kind of get in a little more and just see how some people are pulling on certain things and jettisoning others.
It's fascinating. I have a friend of mine who deals with blockchain a lot, and you know, we're kind of chat over beer, and he's like, "Look, I could work out a way to show complete transparency to every, you know, piece of yarn that is created, and we could actually embed code in it so you can follow it." And you're like, "Dude, have you been to China? Have you been to a factory? Have you seen what's on a factory floor there? There is no way that you can literally trace a product through a supply chain, through each step in it, through each person who, you know, who actually sews a part onto that jacket, and then trace it out the other end." People are trying to, and I really applaud that. And I really, it is the future, and I hope we'll get there. But it's just, you know, you're trying to take digital technology and apply it to a non-digital world. And so you've got to think of other ways. And I, you know, aside from actually going out there yourself and seeing it, I don't know how you do that, but it's a really exciting time to be talking about these opportunities and see what technologies you could apply to supply chain to try and achieve this process of, well, hopefully transparency, because that's the first step. You know, if you know where your things are made, you know where they're coming from, then you can measure the impact, and then you can say, okay, well, that has X has that impact, Y has that impact, let's go with Y. But totally. I feel like we're still a bit of a fair way off there. But yeah, I reached a bit of a I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what to do next.
So being in the middle of that, how does Ghost fit into there? And do you see specific steps in terms of like more of a life cycle of Ghost as a whole, but also the industry? Because I think what you start to see that some other people can't necessarily is what people have tried to do, what hasn't necessarily worked, and kind of like where you see things potentially going, even if those things don't necessarily exist yet.
Yeah, I mean, one of the good things about this process was just starting from scratch and going, okay, I know what I want to do, and that's achieve as much or as little environmental impact during the creation of a product as possible. And to do that, you have a lot of conversations with a lot of different suppliers about a lot of different things. And through each stage of following a certain raw material or a process, you get to a point where you go, oh, I didn't realize that happened. For example, a lot of the industry is adopting recycled face fabrics. Okay, so made from PET bottles. I mean, that's really kind of hot right now, unfortunately. But what you find and just as a clause that, it's really straightforward to talk to a fabric company or a mill and go, I really like this fabric. Can you make it out of a recycled yarn? They'll go, sure. You know, it might cost you an extra couple of points extra, but it's really easy. Like 5 years ago, it didn't happen at all. Now it's really simple. Anyone could do it. But what's really hard is to actually trace where those PET bottles are coming from, where they're actually being recycled. What you tend to find is a lot of recycling happens in Taiwan, for example, and then that material, the recycled material, will get shipped to someone else, whether it's Korea or Japan or China, before it gets extruded into a yarn, and then that yarn will be shipped somewhere else before it gets woven into a fabric, before the backer gets put on, before it then goes to a cut and sew factory. So we were like, yeah, no, it's got to be recycled, we'll do that. And then when we actually found out what that entails, we're like, hang on, we need to think of this again. But having the time, you know, taking 1.5 years or so to actually start from scratch and go, how do I build a supply chain first before I work out what product I can build with that supply chain? We then had the opportunity to look into where a lot of the recycled material comes from. And what we found is around Shanghai, there's kind of like a 150K kind of diameter circle, which you can plonk down, and you're going to go, right, I can actually find, you can use chemical recycling to recycle the polyester in things like uniforms, for example. So this is what we're doing. And it's actually a Chinese government-sponsored recycling plant, which they've set up. so the raw material, the recycled raw material comes from there. So it's collected things from hospital uniforms, school uniforms, donated clothing, etc. And that doesn't sound like there'd be a lot of that, but there's, you know, millions of pieces of these items which get recycled all the time. So you can take that material and then you can use that as the basis for your yarn, which then gets extruded. And then looking at that supply chain as well, we started talking to these guys who do this waterless dyeing process. So basically you embed the color in the yarn before it's extruded. So you don't have this age-old process of kind of a massive vat of chemicals and water, which you dump a piece of fabric into and wait for it to kind of dissolve itself into the fabric itself. So you've then shortened your supply chain. So you're just a short truck drive away rather than a container load, a shipping kind of container away or an air freight container away. We use this waterless dyeing process, which then reduces the whole water impact, energy, carbon emissions, chemicals. And then we found a factory that we'd worked with before, that I'd worked with before on another project, which again is kind of just down the road. And so you're like, oh, actually, if I put all these things together, I can make this product, and this product can suit the problem I have. And the problem I have is I really want kind of technical high performance ski gear for the environments that we ski in and the kind of the level of skiing that we do. And you can pull those things together, and then you can look at where the trim suppliers come from, and they're just down the road as well, and everything's made there. With guys like Duraflex now, you can actually specify recycled trims. So zip pulls, snaps, things like that can now be made out of recycled materials as well. So when you start adding up all these pieces, suddenly everything kind of snapped into place. And I was like, shit, actually, I can make something which no one's really doing yet, because no one started this process from the perspective I have. And that perspective I have is starting with an aim of having the least impact possible. Everyone else is looking at, well, what's the lowest price I can get it at? Or I've got this relationship that I've used for 20 years, so I'm going to continue to use that relationship. And just source recycled PET bottles. I don't care where they come from. And all these elements, but you have to take time and kind of trace the provenance of each one. Another good example of that is, so making the bags that the final product comes in, so the transparent plastic bags.
Yep.
You can use cornstarch bags now, but they're made in Japan. So you have to ship them from Japan to China to the factory. And just by doing that, like, you're just eradicating all the benefit you had of using that material, because you also don't know how it's going to get composted at the end of its life. You don't know if someone's going to just kind of rip it off, not really understand what it is, and just throw it in the recycling bin, or whether they're actually going to put it in the compost, whether that's going to be actual compost that goes and kind of is, you're just your family friendly compost where it actually gets to see light and air and decompose naturally, or whether it's a kind of a more landfill compost where everything just gets thrown on top of each other and that thing won't compost. So all these elements are so complex, and it's why it takes bigger businesses so long to do something, which is, if you're approaching the problem from the right perspective from the start, is actually a lot easier. It takes time, but it's a lot easier to kind of go, right, well, I can choose X or Y, and now I know that Y is better, so I'll choose Y. And over time of making all these minute decisions, you get to this point where you have a product where you're like, oh, actually, no, I can say it is this, it is this, it is this, it is this. And it's right. It's not marketing. It's not just me kind of claiming something which I don't actually know the provenance of. It's actually saying, well, no, I've researched it. This is what I've found. This is why I've made this decision. And I think the more I can kind of share about that, and the more I can share about that with the other people I work with, hopefully the more of those things will become known. And over time, hopefully it will lead to a positive change. It's hard to think about things like that when you're just kind of one person, sitting going, well, I can take this experience I've had for the last 20 years and try this, and hopefully it'll work. So
yeah. So then with that being said, because this is kind of the point that I get to with some of the stuff that I've been working on, but also with others in your same position, is like, you get to a level where you've opened up this Pandora's box of like, well, I set out to do this single one thing, and it opened up more questions than I have ever had bombarded at me once in my entire fucking life. So like, how do you not get lost in the sauce? How do you take a step forward from that place, and like how do you start to put that together into what Ghost is as a brand?
That's a really good point. I think, over time, dealing with supply chains, I've been dealing with supply chains for 10, 15 years now. And you get used to this process of kind of 3 steps forward, 1 step back. You get used to this process of, oh, this technology that you thought made sense, once you actually look into it, once you adopt it, once you try it, doesn't work out. And so I'm comfortable with the fact that I know that some of the things that I looked at a year ago wouldn't work out. And I was at this point in November last year, literally a month before I started the Kickstarter, of going, this isn't going to work. It's just not going to work. I might as well just give up now. And then, I was at Performance Days and I was meeting some friends there, and they're like, oh, no, you need to talk to this person. And there was this moment where kind of everything fell into place. And I was like, oh, hang on, I can combine that fabric with this mill and that recycling technique and this factory. And I can put all those things together, and what I'm left with makes sense. But, if that moment hadn't happened, if I hadn't gone there and had that conversation, none of this would be possible. And I think the other thing is just trying to make sure at the end of the day, as for any designer, you're actually solving a problem and you're solving a need. And for me, making high performance technical outerwear that was cool but also sustainable solves that problem. I mean, I don't, a good friend of mine runs Patagonia Switzerland, so I can't say anything bad, but Patagonia is kind of, I admire what they're doing on a sustainability front, but I wouldn't call it cool, and I wouldn't buy it. Lots of people do, that's great, but it's just not me. Especially if you're familiar with what I do at Faction, it is really kind of a core audience and a subset of skiing. And it's maybe not for everyone's taste, but that's fine. I don't really want to appeal to everybody. I just want to appeal to those people who are kind of, purists at heart and love what they do and love the sport and love getting out in the mountains, but still want stuff that to them is cool. And I know that's an easy kind of tag to kind of say, but I'm probably not cool anymore either. But that's the aim for me, was actually having outerwear which is fucking cool, but actually sustainable as well. So I can feel good about buying it, and I can feel good about recommending it to my friends and showing it to my friends and going, hey, this is what we've done and this is what we've been able to achieve. Like, and I've been lucky that I've got a lot of friends who are also conscious of that and who want something similar and have been able to support me so far, which is fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you kind of bring up that point of the community, and like it seems like that next step that you took in order to really get Ghost going came from the ability to connect with people that you had talked about when we first started talking here, was that being able to share information is kind of what helps elevate everyone and helps kind of get you through those sticking points. But I think it's so interesting because in this time right now where technology is kind of shooting off into this crazy void that we don't understand, it seems like community and like this human-centered approach to all of this is going to be the key to this next step forward, kind of both as we all solve these issues, but also like it's interesting how much that plays a role in the supply chain portion of this, which is like, if this was all just tracked or handled by technology, you could easily just input something and have this end process come out. But it's the fact that it's all handled by humans at every step that turns it into this crazy gray area of like, okay, well, why did you choose this when I said this? And now you're having to work those things out with another person, and you can't do that necessarily with, like you were saying, technology can play a role, but it's not going to fix the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, it will change things. I mean, there will be a point in the next couple of years, 5 years or so, where a designer can literally sit there and choose a fabric from that he's using or she's using, and know the provenance of it and know the impact, and be able to actually calculate. Oh man, imagine! Can you imagine the time when I can sit there and draw something and spec a fabric or spec a trim, and something will be able to tell me the actual environmental impact of that decision? I mean, that would be fantastic. But that doesn't solve a lot of the problems that you have on a day-to-day basis with a business. The things that solve problems on a day-to-day business are loyalty and relationships. And, as I said before, I've been lucky enough to work in supply chains for a long time, and I feel comfortable on a factory floor as much as I do in a board meeting. And what I know is that the relationship that you have with the person who's actually sewing that piece of fabric together or pressing that ski is just as important as your relationship with the person who's going to fund it. Totally. Because at the end of the day, when something goes wrong, every single person in that supply chain needs to have a reason to actually go, well, I'll bother to fix it for that person, or I'll just kind of let it pass. And if you have a personal relationship with those people, and if they understand what you're trying to do as a human being and as a business, then they're more likely to be part of that, solving those problems, than just kind of letting those problems go, if you see what I mean. Yeah. And it also comes down to community as well. I think actually, and this is a bit of a side topic, I think what's happening politically around the world at the moment is also helping people bond, because there's a lot of people who, agree or don't agree with what's happening politically in the UK at the moment, for example, or in America at the moment. And I think that's actually helping people who ordinarily wouldn't talk about things like this actually have conversations and find common ground that they normally in the past wouldn't have. I'm very lucky that I live in a small community. I'm very lucky that this is a community of people who come from really diverse backgrounds, and culturally as well as geographically, as well as demographically. Like, it's a ski resort, so there's some rich people and there's some people with just ski bumps. But it's really easy for me to find common ground with other people who ski, and I think anyone who skis finds it really easy to find common ground with people who ski, no matter if they're in Alaska or if they're in Japan or if they're in Australia or wherever. Like, we have a common bond, and that is wanting to get outside and explore the mountains and enjoy nature and push our own limits. So it's relatively easy for me to meet someone else who skis and talk about what I'm trying to do with Ghosts, for example, or what I did with Faction. And it's a bit harder for me to kind of maybe go and meet someone in the UK, for example, or Paris, and try and find common ground. So the thing about community and working within your relationships and within your community, I think, is the start of any idea, and getting that idea to kind of duplicate itself and move beyond. And then hopefully it can move beyond those kind of community boundaries out into the bigger area.
Yeah, that's interesting. Was that something that you had kind of learned throughout doing the work that you were doing, or did you have that instilled in you as a younger kid and pulled that into the business world?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I was a ski bum before I got involved in the business side of things. And then, as a designer, I came out of university not knowing anything. And I was still so I went from product design into graphic design. So I was doing kind of brand guidelines for guys like Ford and Foster's and Coke and things. And even then, as a graphic designer, you were kind of a step away from the client, and you're kind of a step away from the work you were doing. Like, it was hard to think of the work you do as actually solving a problem. Whereas a product designer thinks of a problem first and what they're trying to do to create a solution for that problem. And I think that's unusual in a business context, whereas a lot of people still that I meet just kind of think about building a business as just an opportunity to build something. They don't really think of it as, what problem are they solving? How are they going to make life better for a customer? And how are they going to kind of keep that customer as part of a community? So I don't actually know if that came from building Faction, because when I built Faction, the internet had just really started. New schoolers had just blown up. I started about the same time as Armada and Forefront Online, and everyone was just kind of like, oh my God, there are these new ski grounds, wicked. And it was all on new schoolers, so it was all done through a community. But I think as a business grows, it's easy to forget about that, because at the end of the quarter or whatever, a lot of the time you're not actually talking or skiing with the customer. You're just looking at a figure that says, well, we got this amount of growth and we got this amount of new followers on Instagram. This is a really interesting topic, is that with Ghosts, for the first time in years, I was actually going back to being the person who was doing all the social media and interacting with people again. And I was really scared. I was really nervous about, shit, I've got to have those same conversations that I had 15 years ago about people calling me up going, Tony, is this jacket good? Or is it bad? Or is it like, why did you make that bit green? Why didn't you make that bit red? And like stuff like that. And you're like, wow, I haven't had these conversations with people in a decade. Literally, even though I see a lot of people on faction skis and especially around in Verbier, given that this is where we kind of started. A lot of them are my friends, but it's cool going to new places and still seeing someone in faction knowing, oh, I could probably go up and talk to that person. And there's probably a story about how he found the brand and how or she found the brand and bought the product and why they bought the product and the experience they had on it. So the exciting thing for me with Ghosts is actually starting that process again and going, yeah, I can build something, and through the product that I have, that I've created, hopefully inspire that person to either get outside and do something that they wouldn't have ordinarily done, or look into sustainability as well and try and learn something, or just have a conversation with them and kind of find out about their world and where they come from and where they're going and what they want and what they aspire to, and be part of that relationship, because I think that's the most rewarding thing, even in business. I think that's the most rewarding thing is partaking in activity with other people and learning from them. And hopefully them learning from you as well. Yeah. It's about, sharing experiences. Like talking to you. I wouldn't have had this opportunity to learn from you and your experience unless you'd reached out because of Ghosts. So, I think that's part of the most interesting thing of this process.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting to think about how a lot of big businesses they get to this point where they're so large that they almost can't have that connection anymore. And nowadays, how much of I can't say how many countless businesses I've seen have tried to outsource customer service, and then it means that you're kind of severing this link between the people that you're selling to and the people that are actually creating all this stuff. And so you start to see the disconnects kind of just go further and further apart.
Yeah, and it's the first thing that happens. It's the first thing that happens when you start scaling up, is that you outsource customer service and you outsource your social media. And actually, it's the worst thing you can do. I nearly actually did that with Ghosts. I nearly hired someone to kind of come in and do social media. And I was like, no, hang on, that's the stupidest thing I can do, because, for whatever intents and purpose, Ghosts is me. It's an extension of what I'm kind of feeling at the moment, my reaction to the world around me, both politically and environmentally and whatever. So what we put out there should be an extension of my perspective and the things I like, my beliefs, my perspective on life. So, it is easy, because it's easy to think about outsourcing customer service because they're always the most complicated conversations to have. But you should, even in my personal philosophy is, even at a managerial level, you should still be having some of those conversations, even if it's only for a few hours a week or whatever, because you learn so much from those interactions. And it's really easy as you grow a business and as you scale a business to kind of take a step back and lose touch with what's actually kind of going on within your consumer base and within the industry at large.
Yeah, I think it's so funny too, because it's like you get to a point where the companies are trying to do all this like market research and stuff to figure out what kind of products need to come out, or what sorts of things to change and how to get through that, when it's like, hey, why don't we just talk directly to somebody that actually has bought our stuff? Why is that the last thing that anyone wants to think about?
The thing I hate most in this world is trend books. I cannot stand trend books. If I, as a designer, need to go and ask someone what is going to be cool in 2 years time, that means I'm completely out of touch with my own industry. Yeah. It's ridiculous. If you're not out seeing what people are wearing, seeing what people are skiing on, seeing what people are doing, if you're not looking at where subculture is coming from and where trends are coming from, that I don't really see how you can design. That's where it comes from. I don't know. It is interesting.
Well, it's also cool to talk to people like yourself, because I think, I'm a graphic designer right now, and this is kind of my step into more of the product world for what seems like a very similar decision that you made, which is like, I'm making all this stuff and I'm one step removed from where it's all coming from and who it's going to. And it's just like, there's not a level of decision making that I want to be able to have and understand in terms of the broader piece and how that all comes together. And I also think it's interesting because a lot of these conversations that I have, I kind of get into people's backgrounds a little bit more, just because I think there's a lot of times like small little nuggets that come out of what you had done before that lead to where you're at. Could you talk a little bit about Faction and kind of like maybe even before that, like this transition from graphic designer to product designer to like, you know, building a bigger business and now reinventing that entire process?
Well, that's a really good point, because you know, you meet people in the industry who are they work for a big brand, and so for example, like Faction did our apparel ourselves under our own brand for a couple of years, but it didn't really work, and there's a couple of reasons why it didn't really work. And it's easy to look back and go, oh, it didn't work because of X, but you know, for whatever reason. And we tried to hire some designers, and a lot of them had worked for bigger businesses, and they were like, yeah, well, we use, you know, this trend book and we choose this fabric. And you sit there and kind of go, okay, well, why did you choose that fabric? And why do you believe that this will happen? And for me, because I'd started Faction and I'd kind of learned a lot of the processes as I go, there was still a lot of insecurity that I was this kind of outsider. You know, I hadn't worked within this industry, the snow sports industry. I was kind of making my own way. I had a lot of friends in it, but you know, I wasn't cool. I wasn't working at Vocal. I wasn't creative director at K2. I was just this, you know, kind of ex-product designer, a creative like guy who just decided to start kind of throwing myself into the deep end because I wanted to. And in the early days of Faction, so I designed all of the physical aspects of the skis, the shapes, the layouts, etc., the construction, and I also did all the graphics. And that literally was till about 2 years ago. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I did all of that until it got to the point where it's like, I can't physically do all this. I need to get someone else in. But yeah, you employ people, and because I'd learned everything myself as I went, I was very intimidated by talking to a lot of people who had this kind of industry experience. And it's only by going through this process, I'm now like, I don't actually care what that person comes in and talks to me about. You know, unless you can actually kind of justify what you've done and the decisions you made and why you've made those decisions, and they have valid reasons, then I don't really want to know. Like, and it all comes back to, for me, this knowing your supply chain, knowing your end user, and being able to kind of talk, not authoritatively, but, you know, with confidence that, yeah, you know, you understand where your product's coming from, you understand where your brand is going, you understand the person that you're trying to sell it to, you understand the problem that you're trying to solve for those people. And so that informs the decisions that you're trying to make. And so if you can say those things and you can talk through those things, then I'm happy. And I realize I haven't actually answered your question. Sorry,
I think you're answering it. You're going in a circle all the way around until you hit it in the middle.
So yeah, I mean, the journey with Faction was really like, okay, I want to start making skis, because at the time it was kind of the early 2000s. A lot of my friends and we were trying to compete on what was then the IFSA World Tour, but I was already in my late 20s. I was way too late. I was, you know, I was going competitions with guys like Gurlan Shishiri, who was 19, and just hucking off everything. I was like, oh shit, I'm way too old for this. But, you know, I had the skill set, and the skill set was product design. The skill set was looking at products and be able to go, okay, well, if that works for this, then I can change that and see how that affects that. And I found this little factory in Evian, which is just kind of south of Geneva, who'd make some skis for me. So I started playing around. I emailed all my friends and went, hey, does anyone want to buy some skis? You know, I'll think up this brand name and chuck some graphics on and see what happens. And I had like, I remember the first year it was 44 pairs. I drove 44 pairs of skis back across the border on Christmas Eve under a blanket in a rented car to my studio. And I left.
That's what it's all about right there.
It was, well, the factory were like, you know, you have to declare these at the border, right? I'm like, what do you mean declare them? I had no idea there were things like import taxes and duties and everything. I literally knew nothing. But I'd already built a few websites. I could spread what I was doing on, you know, places like New Schoolers and a lot of these magazines, which were just starting out as well. And so a lot of it was literally just learning as I went. And then as we kind of grew organically, getting friends in who'd done sales or done marketing and who knew a bit about what they were doing and had contacts, and just kind of growing that organically. And that went on for kind of six or 7 years. And then we got to a point where it was like, right, okay, I haven't actually ever drawn a salary from this thing. And my girlfriend's getting really shitty with me now, our living style. And so we need to kind of make this real and make this solid. And so me and my business partner, so we went out and we found some venture capital money, some angel networking money. And that helped actually kind of formalize the structure, excuse me, and actually go, right, okay, well, if we want to get to this point in 5 years, how do we get there? What's the team we need to develop, to put in place? So that was at the point my role then shifted to kind of like, oh, how do I start managing people? And I'd never done that either. And I'm a bit of an introvert. So, you know, going from doing everything myself to actually having to kind of hand off things, which normally I would do, I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. So that was a big kind of learning process as well. And then suddenly you're selling 20,000 pairs of skis a year, and you're like, shit, I've got to deal with, you know, warranty claims and the product development timeline, which used to take 6 months, turns into 18 months. And, you know, suddenly you find you actually got an amazing team of people who are all really competent in what they do and are confident and have the experience you want and are just in a great position. And that was the kind of the point where I got to. And a year and a half ago, I was like, well, you know, I've spent 15 years on this. If there's any point where I can actually change and say, look, this is fantastic, but what else do I want to do and what else is out there? Now's the time to take it. And that was the point where we tried to work with apparel for a couple of years, and for whatever reason, it wasn't doing what we wanted. And I got more and more frustrated with the fact that you go to trade shows and it's, you know, Denver in January or Munich in January, and it should be -20 and it's fucking +10 and it's sunny outside and people are wearing t-shirts and you're like, something's not right here. And you're in these halls, and in the halls they're all talking about, let's all get back to nature and you know, explore the outdoors. And I'm sitting there going, guys, shouldn't we be talking about saving the fucking planet right now? And it just got to this point where I was like, I've got 2 kids now and I want them to go skiing, and everything's changing so fast that I don't know if that opportunity is going to happen, and I don't know if I can do anything to actually make a difference. But you've got to start somewhere, and you got to get the ball rolling. And that was that point where I was like, hang on, no, I can do this. But it means setting up a new business, and it means starting from scratch, because it's impossible. It is almost impossible to backwards engineer a sustainability ethos into an existing business, because you've got to approach everything from scratch, and you've got to assess every single element of how you work and on top of your supply chain, and go, right, is this right? Is this wrong? And businesses just can't afford that time or energy or the implications of what that means. So the only real way I could do that was starting from scratch. And so that's where I've kind of ended up.
Yeah.
If that
it answers the question. It's interesting, because I was up until kind of the last little portion there, I was going to ask what the catalyst was, because it seems like there's a lot of times people get to a point where they're like, I need to do this other thing, but then they don't actually pull the trigger on it. And it seems like the catalyst was the fact that it wasn't really working anywhere else. And it's definitely been interesting. That's kind of been my step into more of this intersection of sustainability and business, is watching other people try and do it and being like, man, you're just not doing it. And it almost, like, to a degree, doesn't seem like people are really trying that hard. It just seems like they're throwing up a message and then calling it a day and being like, yep, here's our sustainability stuff, like, there we go. And it's like, okay, well, that seems like a pursuit that you could go after for the rest of your life. So why is this one decision and done type of thing?
No, and it is frustrating. And to be honest, I have kind of felt, you know, I'm 46 now, and I'm just at that point where everyone's getting older in my life. You know, my parents are getting older, and they're kind of questioning what they're doing and what they've done, and how they have purpose, you know, and what their purpose is. And yeah, definitely just over this last year, or 2 years, it's been, what is my purpose, and how do I actually justify this blessing that I have, which is just being alive and being on this earth, and how can I make the most of it, and how can I try and inspire others, and how can I take the experience that I've had through Faction and actually use that to create something hopefully better and with a more positive impact, even though, I hope what we achieved with Faction was good as well. But, there is that point that I don't want to go and just work for a fucking investment bank or something like that. I don't think that's a positive benefit to anybody. And I think I kind of have a duty to also to my daughters and my children to actually say, like, if it fails, it fails. But I think you got to try. And I think if you have experience in a certain area and you have knowledge in a certain area which other people don't, I almost feel there's this obligation to say, stick your hand up and go, no, hang on, look, we've got to try this, or you've got to do this. And I feel maybe myself in the past when I was younger, I probably didn't have the confidence to actually get up and say, hang on, this isn't right. Why are all these skis really skinny? It's shit, Can we make fat skis? It is a bit like that. And well, I guess I did that. But, I've kind of felt for the last years that I was doing something wrong, because all the people I talked to who are running bigger businesses like Patagonia and Quicksilver, whoever, weren't doing these things that I saw that you could do. And it was only when I actually sat down with them and went, well, why aren't you doing that? And they're like, well, we can't. It's not because we don't want to. It's because we just don't have the resources or the ability or the freedom in their position to be able to do what you want to do. And at that point, you're like, shit, yeah, no, hang on, I can do this. And just because no one else has done it doesn't mean it's not right. It just means no one else has had the opportunity to do it. Okay. And I think that was a massive learning curve for me too, even at my age and the experience I've had of starting my own business and getting it to be successful, being able to again sit there and kind of go, hang on, am I right about this? Because my background isn't in the apparel industry, even though I've had kind of 6-7 years designing apparel through what we tried to do with Faction. My knowledge is only a certain amount of it. But once I started asking questions, I started meeting a lot of people who were experts in their fields and who did have the experience I needed to help me see this kind of vision through. So I think everything I've done with Faction has kind of led up to this point, and the relationships I've built through the last 15 years of Faction has helped me actually manifest what I want to do with Ghosts and actually execute it and get it happening and hopefully get to the next stage. So I guess we'll find out over the next couple of months.
Yeah, well, it seems like you took the first step, which is getting the Kickstarter up and actually, rocking that out. So congrats on all that.
Yeah, thank you. That's that it takes a lot of balls, to be honest, to actually get to that point and go, yeah, I'm actually going to do this. And I have a lot of respect for anyone who actually does get off their ass and do something like that, because it's difficult. It's really difficult.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's interesting, and I think it's so cool that you bring up the fact that you kind of felt like an outsider for the longest time, and like you even still kind of feel like that when you're stepping into things that you don't necessarily know like other people. But I think that is kind of what's needed nowadays, because there's a lot of these, whether it's the apparel industry or the outdoor industry as a whole, or whatever else, it seems like there are people that have kind of gotten themselves into a position where they're entrenched in this one way of doing things and one way of looking at the world. And it kind of takes people like you and people doing things like you of stepping into something that they don't understand to be like, I'm going to try this anyway. And even if it doesn't work for me, maybe someone else can take that learning and make it work in a different way.
It's really hard in this industry, because a lot of it is based on, we're all guys, we're all trying to huck the biggest cliffs we can. We're all trying to kind of show off. And at the same time, if you go into a meeting with people, and I've embarrassed myself so many times with questions that I'm going, this is the stupidest question I think is possible. And I ask it and people go, oh, no one's ever asked that question. Yeah, well, we do that because of this. And I've been incredibly lucky that I've met a lot of people who have a massive amount of industry experience, and I haven't been cocky, and I haven't been like, well, we should do things this way. I've been going, well, what do you think? What I want to learn from you. And I've been lucky that, people respond to the fact that if you ask them their opinion and what they think you should do, if you then decide to go, well, I appreciate that opinion, but I believe this, so I'm going to go and do this, they'll respect that. And, they don't get offended by it. And they're like, well, cool. Okay, good. Go for it. We'll support you however we can. And, I've got a lot of friends who are kind of looking up to going, oh my God, I can't believe you're doing another business thing. But I'll support it, because I think I've been, I think when you go into something kind of slightly naive and slightly wide-eyed, actually you end up asking questions which other people don't ask. Yep. And people appreciate being able to kind of give support and actually share their experience. And so, I'll happily go into a meeting with someone and go, look, I know nothing about your domain of expertise. I don't know anything. What I want to get to is here. Like, do you think it's possible? How can you do it? If you don't think it's possible, what bridges have you kind of encountered that you haven't been able to get over? And I'm going to try and give it a go anyway. And people respond to that. And so I've been very lucky that that's kind of the situation. And I think also, this is slightly random, but being an Australian in Europe, you don't have these preconceived notions of what different cultures are going to be like and how they should interact. Or even in America, like, I mean, if I was Canadian in America trying to start a business, I'm sure it'd be difficult. But
you can kind of use that as an excuse too, right? Like, oh, I didn't know that you had to handle it like this or something, and you kind of fall back on like
completely
allowing yourself to ask those like stupid questions and get away with it.
Yeah. No, definitely. Because, being Australian, I kind of have this, it's lucky that everyone thinks Australians are really nice and easygoing, and we kind of are. But it means like if you say something stupid, they just go, Australian. And you're like, yeah, whatever, it's fine. But like, it means that I'm lucky that I'm in this region of the world where I don't fit. And it means that I'm looking at every single culture and region I interact with kind of wide-eyed as well. And every different region, even different regions of Switzerland, have different ways of interacting and different kind of business, I guess, what do you call them? Ways of working together. And I kind of throw that all out the window. So, I mean, but people are fine with it. So it means that I'm not kind of bound by any kind of previous kind of conception of how I should interact with these people, which means I can just be kind of open and treat them with respect, obviously, but actually ask things that other people might not because of their cultural backgrounds or whatever.
Definitely.
That's a bit of a different conversation entirely, but it's actually been quite a benefit to me.
Yeah, so I want to kind of go back to like the piece that you had talked about briefly, which was like now you're starting to do all of this yourself again. So I'm assuming the first step in like, okay, I'm going to actually get this going now, I'm going to do this. The first step was kind of what you knew, which was more of the supply chain side, which is, you dive into that, you have all this, splintering into different things, you're dealing with all that. How does the other end of it, like the marketing or the technology or the social media, like how do you start to form all this other stuff around what you're trying to get done?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, so with Faction, even though kind of when we started, I was doing everything, after kind of a decade or so of that, what I was mainly overseeing was the product itself, the creative direction of the brand, and then a little bit of the marketing. So kind of taking the brand ethos itself, turning that into campaigns, and then giving the campaigns over to the marketing guys, and they'd kind of flesh it out and actually turn that into activations. And at the same time, as one of the founders, I was also overseeing the business strategy itself, so what we want to do long-term, how we get there, how that kind of manifests itself. And just because of my analytical background, I was also quite heavily involved in how we build out the operational timelines for everything. So it meant that I could take that structure that I've learned and gone, right, I want to fit this product into it. How do I build a timeline? How to build an operational calendar? How do I get all those different elements that need to be done happening? And then where I knew I was lacking in an area, I could call up a friend and go, can you help me with this? Can you help me with this? I don't know anything about this. Can you help me with this? But to be honest, the biggest challenge has been going back into kind of marketing stuff and I'm quite comfortable in copywriting. I'd always write our catalogs, for example. I'd always be the person who wrote the intros every year, and I'd be the one who kind of guides the ethos of where the brand is and where we want to go with Faction. So I was quite comfortable with that, but I actually found with Ghosts that I was getting to a point where I thought it would be easy. I thought it'd be easy starting again to actually put more personality into it, and I found I couldn't. I got to this point where I was like, I need my wife to check my copywriting, because my copywriting is shit for some reason. And
I do the exact same thing.
I don't know why. I think it's a bit like, if you're a graphic designer and you got to design something for yourself, it's like you are the worst client possible. You can't come up with anything. It changes every week. You're never happy. It's like, I don't know. So the hardest thing I found was actually trying to work out how to copyright, how to look at the marketing side of things, how to look at the social media. And in the end, I kind of, it really did take my wife, who's, been with me through 15 years of Faction and everything, and has literally been a fucking rock in the corner there, who never kind of pops her head up, but she's always there behind everything. And it literally took her sitting me down, going, Tony, look, if you were sitting down at a bar and talking to one of your friends, how would you explain what you're trying to do? Or, how would you go through Instagram and kind of go, I really love that, and I really love that stuff, and I really love that stuff, and just be comfortable that you are the thread that holds these things together. So, Instagram has random shots. Well, they might be random to other people, but they make complete sense to me. I've got shots of Tokyo, and then I've got shots of the Alps, and then I've got shots of, polluted rivers and stuff like that. Like, in my head, these are all the things that go together. Like, my world is techwear, and it's skiing, and it's supply chains, and it's design and creative processes. So pulling all those elements in kind of makes sense to me. But I realized that there might not be a consistent thread yet for someone who's kind of viewing this brand externally. And actually, a lot of that is because of the sales channel at the moment. Going through Kickstarter is really based around the product itself and what the benefits of the product are, what all the features are, what it does, how it does it, how much it costs. And so that's a different environment from creating a brand. If I had the luxury of 5 years, then I would really be building this brand differently. I'd be basing it around kind of a stronger visual style, for example. I'd be seeing that visual style through everything, and that visual style probably wouldn't be communicating the product as well as I kind of needed to, for example. So there was a real conscious decision to kind of say, okay, ideally, I want this to be a long-term brand, obviously, but I need to just communicate the product benefits in a really short period of time, really efficiently and really quickly. So I didn't get the luxury of kind of saying, I just want to create a video that is just blue and maybe has some snow. I don't know, which is what I'd kind of like to do. So yeah, I did have to take the kind of the constraints of how I'm actually trying to distribute the brand now into the back of my mind while I was actually trying to look at how we'd kind of build the marketing out and how the product features should be, etc. If that kind of helps answer your question.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting how nowadays it seems like you almost have to approach it that way, and that it's this iterative process because of how technology works and how quickly things change. You have to kind of like put something out and do it to your best of your ability, but you also do have to put it out, and then you have to take another step forward. And I think what's cool. Yeah.
I want everything to be perfect. I don't want anything to go out there unless it's perfect, and you just can't afford to do that anymore. It's got to get out there. Sorry,
I think what's difficult, at least for me, with that is it's like you can't necessarily see the whole thing put together to make decisions about other things. So it's like everything's kind of at this different stage of doneness, and so it's like, how does this all fit together when this isn't necessarily to completely where I want it, and neither is this. And so like, how does that work as they start to kind of like link up more, and the whole thing comes together?
That's a really good point. I started working, so I did some work last year just as a consultant to some guys in London, and their client was a guy who started a bag brand. And I was kind of helping him formulate the brand strategy and the business strategy and how he was going to get out there. And every time there needed to be a decision made, it kind of kept getting pushed out. And it was like the client, or we were waiting for someone to kind of know what would be the best thing, not what would be the best thing to do, what would guarantee success. And through that process, I realized, like, you've just got to get things out there. Like, if you have indefinite amount of time, you're never going to create a perfect product. It's never going to be perfect, and you're never going to get it out there. So at some point you have to kind of like ignore your own, sorry, my daughter's crying a bit there.
It's all good.
You have to kind of ignore your own perfectionism and just say, I'm just going to get it happening. And actually, that actually happened with my logo as a designer. You know, obviously logos are the most fun you can have. And with Ghosts, I literally went, no, fuck it. It's just going to be the words. And I'm drawing there's a lot of kind of this Japanese mythology of where ghosts come from, or what they mean and what they represent. And so I wanted to infer that, but I didn't want it to sound cheesy or anything. So I had ghosts in Japanese written underneath that. And hopefully people see that and read into it and kind of go, oh, hey, maybe I'll kind of find out and read more. But I literally, for my logo, for the first time ever, was like, no, that's it. It's done. It took me 5 minutes. First thing that came into my head, that's it. Because also I knew that it wasn't really important what the logo was. It was how I represent it, how I use it, how it's conveyed, and everything else around it, rather than, you know, spending 6 months on identity, which I probably would have done in the past.
Yeah, and then you get to a point where you want to change it anyway down the line.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the faction logo changed so many times in a decade. It was stupid, and I got a lot of crap from it for doing that.
Yeah, so that's kind of the other piece that I wanted to talk about, was the backstory of like the name, and then just kind of like the branding as a whole too, like how you're talking about it and the colors that you're using and the imagery, because it's all very different from what you're seeing in a traditional kind of sustainability sense. But also the other side of that I thought was interesting as I was kind of listening to you was the fact that you were talking about the analytical side of yourself and falling back on that, but also how much of this process is creative and how you either balance those two, or maybe you don't necessarily see those as two different things.
No, it definitely is two different things. It's like having two different head spaces or something. It's like, right, you got your business head and you got to think analytically, and then like you got your creative head and do whatever you like. And at some point, I think that's the hard thing to do with your own business, is to be that mediator between those two extremes. And I mean, Ghosts and all the kind of the color, I just wanted something that was different. I was kind of tired of seeing, you know, in the outdoor industry, everything's these shots of the mountains and people running up the side of hills or like stuff like that, and it just bored me. I just, you know, the things I was pulling from and where my interests are is really an urban background. I come from Melbourne, and I come from a city, and even though I've ended up in the mountains, that's kind of where my style influence comes from. And I just wanted something that was really simple and that I hadn't seen much of. And literally the first thing that came to mind was this kind of blue wash. From that point, I was like, right, everything needs to just be black and white, or this strong blue wash that just has its own color that you can see and identify with. And that is enough. And, you know, in the past, I've spent a lot of time building brands and brand guidelines. And when you've got a lot of people you need to direct, that's important. But for this, I really just wanted it to capture that kind of element of an idea and then just go with it. And I'd had the name Ghosts kind of came from, actually, there's this beach in Melbourne, which we kind of head back there every year or so. And there's this one beach down in Melbourne that for some reason, every time I'm there, I think of really good ideas. I should go back there more often.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah, but this idea of kind of ghosts came up, and it just inspired so many different kind of interpretations. There's this idea that we want to have as little environmental impact as possible. Like we want to literally kind of move through the world as though we don't have any physical form. I mean, that would be a pretty amazing ideal to have, you know, no footprints, that kind of stuff, no impact. And so there was that idea of ghosts. And at the same time, all this stuff that was happening politically, it was this kind of feeling that no one was listening to what we want as people. I mean, Brexit is a mess. Trump is a mess. You know, like this whole idea that there's this whole kind of section of the community of the world that just isn't being heard. And while we're all harping on about saving the environment, everyone else is worried about, I don't know, taxation or something. Like it just, there's this entire disconnect between what seems to be important and what's actually being talked about in my head and my community. So this idea of that we all feel like we're kind of ghosts, you know, we all feel like our voice just isn't being heard was another angle that resonated with me. And then one of my friends, the artist Takasudo, is this Japanese Canadian, and we started talking as well, and we started talking about ghosts as this symbolic thing in Japanese kind of mythology. And there's this mythology of the yurei, and it's this idea that you can be trapped in the afterlife until your kind of your reason for being is fulfilled. And that's what a yurei is. It's this kind of trapped ghost. And that also resonated with what I was where I was in my life. You know, and this idea that I really needed to do something which actually felt like it had positive impact, even though, you know, what we did with Faction was fantastic. Like just helping people enjoy being outdoors is fantastic. But I felt like I really wanted what I was doing to actually have a positive impact. And my knowledge around what was happening with the apparel industry was kind of where everything was coming together, and where I started seeing these kind of chains of, you know, these supply chains, if you will, and technologies coming together to actually do something which hadn't been done before. So there was all these kind of similar things, and I was like, ghost, it's kind of a bit of a weird word. And I wrote it down, and then I said it to a couple of people, and they're like, oh, Craig. So Craig's this guy I've been working with. He does all our video stuff, and all our photography, and he's literally, I've worked with him for kind of 10 years. And he was like, that's cool, do that. I'm like, great, cool, done. And then literally I kind of handed over to him, and he's the guy who basically took that raw inspiration of visually where it was coming from and built the video work around it. And that then kind of dictated back what I did visually and creatively. So I actually do owe him a lot of thanks for kind of putting all that together, because I was too close to it. You know, as my own Burke says, I needed to kind of verbalize it, get it out there, have him interpret it and send it back to me and kind of go, yeah, that's it. Cool. Done.
Yeah. I think that's the crazy process that I think you were hinting at before, of like trying to design for yourself, is like you don't have someone else to bounce an idea off of to kind of like vet it in a different way, or to be able to throw it back to you with another question and have you be like, yeah, I never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
And until you can kind of have someone else to say like either, oh, this is cool, but I don't like it because of this, or maybe the opposite, you can't really understand more of like your own stance on it until you're able to do that.
Yeah. I'm really lucky that I've got, there's some guys here that I've worked with for kind of over a decade, you know, friends I've known a long time, and they're, you know, in creative industries or marketing or whatever. And I can actually throw it to them and go, does this make sense? Is this good? And they'll either be like, yeah, that's great. Or they go, no, Tony, that's just shit. Do not do that. And, you know, everything I kind of threw out there with Ghost, they're like, this is really great. Do it. Just get it out there. And I was like, really? Shit. Okay, I'll give it a go.
Totally. Well, to kind of wrap this up, what's next? You just had the Kickstarter go up, which has been funded, and congrats on that again. Like, what's the next step? Whether that's, you know, either more products or building out the brand more, or, you know, what else is coming?
Yeah, I think so the first thing I don't want to do is I do not want to get back into a traditional distributor chain of things. You know, I don't want to go brand, distributor, sales agent, store, consumer. You know, I think there are other ways of doing things, and there are stores that I'm talking to in different parts of the world who have really strong consumer bases that they work with, that I kind of want to partner with to do things in a different way than you kind of traditionally look at building a brand. And I don't want to take, you know, I don't want to do the go to trade shows. I don't want to do trade shows anymore. I do it at trade shows. No, I don't want to do seasonal collections either, because I think that's just our whole industry is forced into this kind of seasonal way of thinking. And I don't, for the life, I've done it for over a decade, and I don't really know why.
Yeah.
People don't buy that way. Stores don't want to buy that way. They don't want to have to put everything on 50% off if it doesn't snow. They don't want to have stock which is instantly out of date. So I want to look at other ways of doing things, and there are interesting guys out there like Taylor Stitch, for example, which I believe are out of San Francisco.
Yep.
I don't know, but so they do a kind of a Kickstarter format, but through their own network. So they design stuff, they put it out there, they go, hey, is anybody interested in this? Do you like it? And if enough people go, yeah, that looks cool, then they go, great, we'll make it. And I think there's different ways of working. So maybe there's having collections which are in store versus collections which will only be available online, and different ways of managing those relationships. Because in the past, you tend to find that brands and stores tend to fight each other a little bit. The brands kind of want to sell direct, and they want that margin, and they want to have that customer. But at the same time, stores are so relevant, and people want to walk into a store and they want that experience, and they want to understand the brand, and they want to know that they're buying something from someone who is informed and can actually sell them what they need. So I think stores are kind of, what's the word? I think they play a much more important part in this whole kind of how do we actually sell a product than a lot of brands kind of give them credit for. And so I think there's a lot of new ways to work there. And so that's really the process, is get this kind of Kickstarter done, get that first kind of product out the door, and then look at how I can build those relationships I have, and build that over the coming kind of 6 months, year, and look at the other products I want to create, because there's a lot of different problems out there that need to be solved, is how I think of it. In terms of skier types and snowboarders, and what type of product they want to wear, and how they want it to perform, and what kind of characteristics they want it to have, and sustainability wise as well, what they want it to solve. So yeah, that's what I'm kind of building out now.
Awesome. Yeah, it's cool because you kind of have dissolved like these boundaries that you would have if you're in a traditional business model. And it's cool to see, like you mentioned with Taylor Stitch, people not only approaching the product side or the design side or the marketing side differently, but also how those all come together and how you're selling those products. And it kind of brings me back to that point of like this weird transition period of like, some of these systems work, but they're not necessarily working with each other the right way. So it's cool to see that, your next step is kind of tackling an issue that's even like a level up from just the product side of it.
Yeah, and I hope I'll come at it with my my usual naiveness and just go, why haven't we done that? Or why haven't we done that? And I'm sure that half of my ideas will be wrong, but hopefully some of them will resonate with some people along the way. And like Faction, hopefully part of my gut instinct will get me through.
Yep. 3 steps forward, 1 step back.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, man. Is there anything else that you'd kind of want to say to listeners, whether that be, some words of wisdom or anything you got?
Words of wisdom. No, I'd just like to say thank you, everyone, for the time and the support, and the response has been amazing. And hey, I'm easy to get in touch with. If anyone has any questions, ghostsapparel.com and send us an email, or hit us up on Instagram or Facebook, whatever. And I'm easy to find. I'm easy to talk to. So I welcome all forms of communication.
Awesome.
Yeah,
sweet.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. And will the products be available on the website after the Kickstarter is complete, or how will that end up?
Yes, but we'll have very limited stock. They won't be available online until closer to the winter.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So people got to jump on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank
you so much.
Appreciate it.
No, thank you. Have a good evening, everybody. And day, where you guys are. And I will talk to you soon.
Cool. Take it easy.
Cheers.